Welcome to Founding Chronicles. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Now, let's uncover a chilling piece of American history asterisk. The year was 1847. America was a land straddling two worlds, half rooted in the old ways of the early republic, half stumbling forward into a new age of invention, industry, and expansion. The streets of Boston bustled with the clipped steps of merchants and sailors, while the frontier pressed ever westward, pulling families into the wild unknown. But in small towns scattered across New England, life moved with a slower rhythm. Guided by the seasons, the church bells, and the unspoken rules of community. It was in one such town, Ashford, Massachusetts, a modest mill village tucked between rolling hills and cold rivers, that a single photograph was taken. At first glance, it was ordinary, the kind of posed family portrait common for the time. A proud father, his wife by his side, their children arranged neatly in stiff wooden chairs. The daguerreotype, caught in the silvery mirror-like surface of the plate, seemed destined to be tucked away in a family album, a keepsake for future generations. But history is never as simple as it appears in frozen images. Photographs may still the body, but they cannot silence the ghosts that move beneath the surface. This particular image, captured on a spring afternoon in 1847, would decades later become the subject of whispers, of fear, of speculation. When examined closely, it seemed to carry within it a secret so dark, so undeniable, that the people who came across it would not look at it the same way again. The family in the photograph were the Whitcombs. Thomas Whitcomb was a respected shopkeeper in Ashford, known for his stern jaw and a devotion to discipline. His wife, Margaret, was quiet, almost delicate, her eyes downcast in nearly every description written of her. They had 3 children. Samuel, age 14, already showing signs of carrying his father's rigid character. Clara, age 10, with a softness to her face that spoke of her mother's gentler ways. And little Joseph, just 6 years old, the baby of the family. The Whitcombs were neither rich nor poor. They lived in a tidy white clapboard house near the center of the village, close enough to hear the bells of the Congregational Church on Sunday mornings, and within walking distance of Thomas's store. They were known in the community, respected, though not beloved. Thomas was the kind of man who drew lines sharply, who frowned at laughter that lasted too long, who measured respectability by obedience. Margaret bore this with a stillness that unsettled some neighbors. There was always a sense, among those who observed her closely, that something sat heavy on her chest, that her smiles came only when forced. On the afternoon of May 3rd, 1847, the Whitcombs visited the small studio of a traveling daguerreotypist who had set up shop in Ashford for only a week. For families like the Whitcombs, a photograph was both a luxury and a necessity, a way of planting themselves into history, of leaving proof of their place in time. They dressed in their finest, Thomas in a dark suit with a stiff collar, Margaret in a dress of simple but neat calico, Clara with her hair brushed and pinned, Samuel in a vest too small for his growing shoulders, and little Joseph squirming, reluctant to stay still for the long exposure. The photographer, a thin man with hollow cheeks and ink-stained fingers, instructed them in the usual manner. Sit still. Do not move. Keep your gaze fixed. The image requires patience. He sat. The lens polished the plate and pulled the cover. The Whitcombs sat frozen, their expression serious, as was the custom. Smiles were rare in such portraits, for holding a grin was nearly impossible during the minute-long exposure. The plate developed slowly, the image emerging like a ghost called forth from silver and mercury. When it was finished, Thomas inspected it with pride. The Whitcombs, he declared, looked proper. The daguerreotype was placed in a small leather case with a clasp and carried home to be displayed upon the mantel. And there, for years, it sat. Visitors to the Whitcomb home would sometimes glance at it, admire it, and move on. It was no different from the dozen or so family portraits scattered through the village home's solemn, stiff, the faces of Ashford preserved in time, but history has a way of waiting. It was in the years after the war, long after 1847, that the photograph would resurface with a new, disturbing light. But to understand the secret hidden in that image, one must understand the story of the Whitcombs themselves. Because photographs do not lie, but they also do not speak. They require context. And the Whitcomb story, like so many of that era, was marked by tragedy. Life in 1847 was harsh, even in a settled town like Ashford. Illness swept through without warning, cholera and tuberculosis taking men and women in their prime. Children were buried before their 10th birthdays with heartbreaking regularity. Death sat close at hand, never far from the hearth or the fields. The Whitcombs were not spared. Only a year after the photograph was taken, little Joseph fell ill. What began as a cough grew worse with each passing week. His small frame weakened, his breath came shallow. A doctor, a man with few remedies beyond laudanum and poultices, could offer little comfort. In November of 1848, Joseph died, his mother, weeping silently at his bedside while Thomas stood stiff, his grief buried beneath a mask of control. The boy was laid to rest in Ashford's small cemetery, a stone marker etched with the words, "Beloved son." Margaret was never the same after Joseph's death. Neighbors noticed her growing frailty, her withdrawn manner, the way she walked. The streets with her eyes lowered. Some whispered that her husband's sternness left no space for her mourning. Others suspected that she carried guilt, though no one could say why. Years passed. Samuel grew into a strong young man, eventually, leaving Ashford for work in the factories of Lowell. Clara blossomed into a quiet beauty, though she rarely left her mother's side. Thomas grew grayer, more rigid. The Whitcomb home, once lively with the noise of children, became a place of silence. By the 1860s, the daguerreotype had become a relic, tucked away in a drawer, forgotten amid the tide of new photographs and keepsakes. It was only in the 1880s, long after both Thomas and Margaret had died, that the image would resurface. Clara, now a woman in her 40s, unmarried and alone, inherited the family belongings. Sorting through her mother's old chest, she found the small leather case. When she opened it, the faces of her family stared back at her from across the decades. And that is when she noticed it. The detail dotted first. It seemed like nothing, a shadow, perhaps, or a trick of the silver surface. But when she leaned close, her heart began to pound. In the corner of the image, faint but undeniable, was the outline of a figure. A figure that should not have been there. It was behind Margaret, near the edge of the frame. A child, pale, blurred, but unmistakably present. His features were soft, indistinct, but his small hand seemed to rest upon Margaret's shoulder. Clara gasped. She knew that face, even half formed in the grain of the plate. She knew it in her bones. It was Joseph. The boy who had not lived past 6 years old. The boy who had been alive when the photograph was taken in 1847. And yet the expression on his face, the strange distance of his eyes, was not that of a living child frozen by the camera's long exposure. It was something else. Something that did not belong. Clara's hands shook as she closed the case. She did not speak of it to anyone for months, perhaps for years. But eventually, whispers began to spread in Ashford that the Whitcomb photograph contained a ghost. But the family portrait was not as innocent as it seemed. Some dismissed it as a flaw in the plate, a common occurrence in the early days of photography. Others swore it was proof that the child's spirit had been there all along, captured in silver, bound to his grieving mother. The story wound its way through the village, then beyond, until the Whitcomb photograph became one of those strange tales passed from generation to generation. And yet the photograph was real. It existed. People saw it. And those who saw it never forgot the feeling it gave them, the chill that ran through their bones as they looked upon it. Because some secrets, once revealed, cannot be unseen. Clara did not sleep the night she rediscovered the photograph. She sat by the small lamp in her parlor, the daguerreotype case open upon her lap, staring into the silver plate until her eyes blurred with tears. Every time she looked away, she felt the weight of the image calling her back. And every time her gaze returned, there he was, her little brother, Joseph, frozen behind their mother, his tiny hand resting in a gesture of quiet possession. She tried to reason with herself. Perhaps it was simply a flaw, a trick of light, a scratch on the plate mistaken for a child's face. But the more she looked, the more she knew. She could not mistake the soft roundness of his cheek, the tilt of his head, the way his hair fell. It was Joseph, as she remembered him, yet not Dot by morning. Her hands trembled as she closed the case and hid it back in the chest. But hiding an image does not erase it from the mind. The sight haunted her every waking hour. When she walked the streets of Ashford, she saw the faces of her neighbors and wondered if they too carried secrets, if their family photographs also whispered truths not meant for mortal eyes. In time, Clara confided in one person, her cousin, Ruth, a stern woman who lived in the neighboring town of Sutton. Ruth had a practical mind, but she was not unkind. When Clara finally told her about the photograph, Ruth frowned, but agreed to come and see it for herself. It was a gray November afternoon when Ruth arrived. The women sat together by the fire, the case between them. Clara opened it with trembling hands, turning the daguerreotype toward her cousin. For a long moment, Ruth said nothing. She leaned close, adjusting her spectacles, her brow furrowed. Then she whispered, almost unwillingly, "I see him." The words hung in the air like smoke. Clara shuddered. She had hoped Ruth would dismiss it, would laugh, and say it was a blemish, nothing more. But Ruth's voice carried no doubt. She had seen Joseph. Ruth closed the case sharply and handed it back. "Do not speak of this to anyone else," she warned. "People will call it blasphemy, or worse. They will say you are touched by madness. Keep it to yourself." But secrets are like cracks in old glass. The more you press against them, the more they spread. Clara tried to bury the matter, but the image gnawed at her thoughts. Sometimes, late at night, she would wake to the sound of small footsteps in the hall, though she lived alone. At other times, she swore she heard her mother's voice, soft and broken, calling Joseph's name as if still at his deathbed. And then, in the winter of 1884, the photograph slipped from her possession into the world. It happened when a young preacher, newly arrived in Ashford, visited Clara's home. Reverend Alden was earnest, eager to win the trust of his flock. He spent hours in the homes of widows and spinsters, listening, comforting, speaking of God's grace. One evening, while Clara fetched tea, he wandered her parlor. His eyes caught upon the small leather case left carelessly upon a side table. Curious, he opened it. When Clara returned, he was staring into the plate, his face pale. "Who is this?" he asked, pointing with a trembling finger. Clara froze. She saw at once that he had found it. Joseph's face. She tried to speak, but no words came. Tears welled in her eyes. The Reverend closed the case and set it down. His voice was hushed, almost fearful. "This is no ordinary image. There is something here, something not of this world." Clara wept. She confessed the whole story, how Joseph had died, how she had discovered his likeness years later, how it haunted her still. The Reverend listened, grave and silent. When she finished, he prayed aloud, asking God to keep the household free. of restless spirits. But word spread nonetheless that the Reverend was a young man, eager to prove himself. Perhaps he told another minister, perhaps a trusted parishioner. Whatever the path, whispers began moving through Ashford like the cold wind that slips through cracks in winter walls. The Whitcomb photograph was cursed, people said. It held the face of the dead Dot by spring. Townsfolk came quietly to Clara's door, asking to see it. Some scoffed, leaving with a smirk. Others departed pale and shaken, swearing under their breath. Children dared one another to speak the name Whitcomb after dark, as if it summoned something. Not all believed, of course. The rationalists of Ashford schoolteachers, shopkeepers, men of science insisted it was a blemish, a smudge of mercury, a distortion. But belief is rarely won by logic. The sight of the image unsettled the heart in ways no explanation could. Men dot, and so the legend began to grow dot. It was in those years that people began retelling the story of Joseph's death with darker shading. No longer was he merely a boy claimed by sickness. Whispers twisted his fate. Some said Thomas Whitcomb's stern hand had been too heavy, that the boy had wasted under his father's rule. Others claimed Margaret, weakened and desperate, had poisoned her own child with bad remedies. None of it could be proven, but gossip thrives where grief has left open wounds. The photograph became a mirror into those suspicions. Look at his eyes, some said. Do they not seem to plead? 2. Accuse? The story shifted from a tragedy to something darker, a tale of hidden cruelty, of family sins etched into silver dot by the late 1880s. Ashford was no longer an isolated village. Railroads brought strangers, and strangers carried tailies. Visitors asked to see the photograph. A newspaperman from Worcester even came, curious about the so-called ghost image. He wrote a small column describing it as a remarkable curiosity, though perhaps only an accident of chemistry. Yet his words only fueled the fire. More came to see it. More left with uneasy hearts. And poor Clara lived in the middle of it all. She had never married, never borne children. Her entire life was bound to the memory of her family, and now that memory was transformed into a story she could not control. Sometimes she wished she had never opened the case that day in her mother's chest. But the dead do not ask our permission to be remembered. Dot. In the winter of 1889, an event occurred that deepened the legend further. A neighbor, Mrs. Harlan, came to call upon Clara. The two women sat by the fire, the daguerreotype upon the table between them. As they spoke, Mrs. Harlan reached to open the case and look once more. The moment she did, a sharp crack split the silence. One of the window panes shattered inward, though no stone had struck it. The cold wind rushed in, extinguishing the lamp. Both women screamed, fumbling in the dark. When at last they relit the lamp, the room was still, but the case lay on the floor, open. Dot, and in the flickering light, Mrs. Harlan swore she saw the image shift, Joseph's eyes no longer blurred, but staring straight out, clear and sorrowful. She fled the house and never returned. From that night on, Clara refused to leave the photograph in plain sight. She wrapped it in cloth, hid it within a drawer, and prayed each evening for peace. But peace never came. She grew frailer each year, her health worn down by solitude and by the unshakable feeling that her little brother lingered, always just beyond the veil. Dot. By the time of her death in 1893, the Whitcomb photograph had become something of a relic in Ashford. The executor of her estate, unsure what to do with it, passed it along to a distant relative in Worcester. From there, it disappeared into the folds of history, turning up now and again in whispers, in rumors, in curious articles about haunted images of old New England. Yet the story never fully died. For some who saw it claimed the truth was unmistakable. The photograph held the image of a child, both living and dead, captured not only by the camera's lens, but by forces beyond understanding. And when people repeated the tale, they often ended with the same uneasy question: if the camera could capture a secret like that in 1847, how many other secrets might be hidden in the photographs we still keep today? By the turn of the century, Ashford had changed. The old mill village had grown into a bustling town with gas lamps along the main street, a rail station, and factories that drew workers from far beyond Massachusetts. Children no longer played in the same narrow lanes where Clara Whitcomb once walked in silence. But even as the world moved forward, some stories clung like cobwebs at the rafters of memory. The Whitcomb photograph was one of them. For years after Clara's death, the daguerreotype seemed to vanish. Her belongings were scattered among cousins and acquaintances, most of whom had little knowledge of its strange reputation. In Worcester, it passed from one trunk to another, gathering dust, overlooked by those who considered it nothing more than an outdated family relic. It might have remained there forever, had it not been for the rise of a new fascination sweeping America: the hunger for spiritualism. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were marked by a profound curiosity about the unseen. Seances, mediums, table rapping, and the promise of speaking with the dead spread across the country like wildfire. Families torn apart by the Civil War had longed to hear the voices of lost sons and fathers. Now, in parlors from Boston to Chicago, people dimmed their lamps and listened for whispers in the dark. And at the heart of this movement, photographs held a special place. Spirit photography, as it came to be called, became a sensation. Men like William Mumler claimed they could capture the faces of the departed hovering beside the living. Though often proven fraudulent, these images ignited hope and fear. They made people believe that silver plates and glass negatives could reveal more than flesh and bone. It was in this atmosphere that the Whitcomb photograph resurfaced. In 1902, a collector of curiosities named Henry Aldrich purchased a trunk of old New England relics from a Worcester estate sale. Aldrich was a man with a taste for the peculiar. His home was filled with cabinets of strange objects: Indian arrowheads, Civil War relics, stuffed birds, even a withered hand he claimed belonged to a pirate. When he opened the Whitcomb trunk, he found the small leather case nestled among brittle letters and yellowing quilts. He opened it and froze. The faces of the Whitcombs stared back at him, solemn and stiff in their Sunday best. But Aldrich's eyes did not linger on the father or mother. They went at once to the faint, blurred outline behind Margaret's shoulder. He leaned close, his breath caught. A child. The more he looked, the more undeniable it became. Though faded, though imperfect, the small figure seemed present, hovering, half there, yet as real as the family itself. Aldrich, who had attended more than one séance and collected more than one haunted relic, felt a chill crawl down his spine. He knew at once what he had found. Within weeks, he was showing the daguerreotype to visitors in his home. He spoke of the Whitcomb family, of the boy who had died young, of the ghostly face that had appeared in the plate. Guests gasped, leaned close, whispered. Some laughed nervously. Others demanded he put it away, swearing they felt watched. As they looked upon it, word spread beyond his circle. By 1904, the Worcester Gazette had published a small article about the ghost in silver, describing the photograph in detail. The writer claimed it was one of the clearest instances yet seen of spirit photography, though he admitted the image was decades older than the craze itself. That paradox only deepened the fascination. Suddenly, the Whitcomb photograph was no longer just a family relic. It was evidence. Evidence that even in 1847, before anyone had spoken of spirits appearing in photographs, something had been captured that defied explanation. Historians and skeptics took notice. Some declared it a flaw, A double exposure, though daguerreotypes could not be exposed twice in the same manner as later photographs. Others claimed the blurred child was merely a shadow, or even a trick of imagination. But the believers had the louder voice. They said Joseph Whitcomb had been there all along, that the grief of his mother had bound him to her so strongly that even the camera's lens could not exclude him. In parlors and lecture halls, the story of the Whitcomb photograph was retold with hushed voices. Each telling added new details. Some said Margaret's eyes were not downcast in modesty, but lowered in sorrow, knowing her lost child stood beside her. Others swore that Thomas's stern expression was more than formality, that he too had seen something in that moment, something he would never admit. The photograph became a symbol, passed from hand to hand, studied by believers, denounced by skeptics, and whispered about by ordinary people who longed for proof that the dead lingered near. But for all the fascination, there was also fear. In 1910, Aldrich loaned the photograph to a traveling exhibition of haunted relics that toured New England. It was displayed in a glass case, visitors lining up to see the ghost child behind the Whitcombs. On the third night of the exhibition in Providence, a fire broke out. The blaze consumed much of the hall, destroying artifacts, scorching walls, leaving only ashes and twisted metal. When the flames were extinguished, nearly everything in that section of the hall had been reduced to rubble. But amid the blackened wreckage, the small leather case was found intact, lying on the floor, as though untouched. The daguerreotype within was unbroken, the faces still staring out as they had 63 years before. For believers, this was proof of its supernatural power. The dead protect their own, one newspaper declared. For skeptics, it was coincidence nothing. More, but no one could deny the unease that grew around the image. It seemed destined to survive, no matter what befell it. Through the 1920s and 30s, the photograph passed into the hands of private collectors. Some displayed it proudly, others kept it hidden, claiming they could not bear the feeling it gave them. Letters from this time survive in which owners described strange occurrences: mirrors cracking without cause, footsteps in empty rooms, the soft sound of a child's cough in the night. Always, the events ceased when the photograph was removed. By mid-century, the Whitcomb photograph had become less visible. The world was changing fast: electric lights, automobiles, radios, wars that shook the earth. People's attention turned elsewhere. Spirit photography fell out of fashion, dismissed as superstition or fraud. The Whitcomb image, however, never fully disappeared. It lingered in the hands of collectors, mentioned in obscure journals, a ghost of a ghost story. Yet every so often, it returned to the surface. In 1952, a professor at Harvard included it in a lecture on early photography, calling it a remarkable case study of human imagination projected upon an imperfect plate. Students whispered afterward that even he seemed uneasy when passing the image around the classroom. In 1968, during the turbulence of that decade, a Boston journalist rediscovered the photograph in a private collection and wrote an article titled, "The Boy Who Would Not Leave." The piece reignited public curiosity, if only for a short while. People came forward with their own stories, their own photographs they swore contained the faces of the departed. But the Whitcomb photograph was always different, always older, always harder to explain, because unlike the faked spirit photographs of the 19th century, it had no trickster's hand behind it, no medium, no money-making scheme. It was an ordinary family portrait taken in 1847, long before the idea of capturing ghosts on film had even been imagined. And yet, when you leaned close, when you looked with your own eyes, you saw him. Joseph, the boy who had died too young. The boy who had stood somehow behind his mother, caught forever in the silver depths of a plate that refused to fade. So the story endured, passed from generation to generation, each retelling adding weight to the mystery. Some called it proof of an afterlife. Others called it a curse. But for all who encountered it, the Whitcomb photograph remained unforgettable, because once you had seen that small, blurred face, you could not unsee it. And once you had felt the chill it carried, you could not forget. The question lingered, like a shadow at the edge of every telling. Was Joseph Whitcomb merely a child lost to sickness? Or was there hidden in that photograph a deadly detail, a truth about his death that no one dared to speak aloud? By the late 20th century, the Whitcomb photograph had become more rumor than relic. For most, it was a curiosity whispered of in historical societies and footnotes in old books about American folklore. The world had raced forward into the age of highways, television, and satellites. The solemn, faded image of a stiff New England family seemed far removed from the noise of modern life. And yet, it had not vanished. In 1977, the photograph surfaced again, this time in the hands of a private collector in Connecticut. His name was Daniel Morgan, a retired insurance adjuster with a passion for antiquities. Morgan was no believer in ghosts. He prided himself on rational thought, on proof, on facts that could be weighed and measured. When he first came upon the daguerreotype in a dealer's box of forgotten heirlooms, he bought it only for its age and condition. But once it was in his home, things changed. Morgan studied the image under a magnifying glass. He knew daguerreotypes well. He had dozens in his collection. But this one unsettled him. The faint figure behind Margaret Whitcomb could not, in his mind, be dismissed as a blemish. The lines were too distinct, the shape too human. He spent nights in his study, light bent low, staring until his eyes ached. His wife grew uneasy. "Why that one picture, Daniel? You never look at the others so long." He shrugged, offering no answer. How could he explain the way it pulled at him, the way it seemed alive, as if the blurred child's face would sharpen if only he looked hard enough? Within a year, Morgan began digging into history. He wrote letters to the Ashford Historical Society, requesting records of the Whitcomb family. Old ledgers, church rolls, and burial records were sent his way. Slowly, a fuller picture emerged. There had indeed been a Whitcomb family. Thomas, Margaret, their children Samuel, Clara, and Joseph. And yes, Joseph had died young, in November of 1848. The records listed consumption as the cause. A tragedy, but not unusual for the time. Yet as Morgan pressed further, he found something unsettling. A doctor's ledger contained a brief, cryptic note about the boy's death. Condition: peculiar. Lungs compromised, but other signs inconsistent. Mother distraught. Father insistent on burial without delay. Morgan's mind turned. Why the rush to bury? Why the word peculiar? He began to wonder if Joseph's death had not been as simple as the records claimed. He shared his findings with no one. But in private, he grew convinced that the photograph did not merely capture a ghost. It captured a truth. The Whitcombs had hidden Dot in 1981. Morgan delivered a lecture at a small historical symposium in Boston. He displayed the daguerreotype for the audience, recounting the story of the family, the ghostly image, the death of Joseph. Some scoffed, others leaned in with fascination. And then, with a quiet firmness, Morgan said something no one had before. "I believe this photograph does not show a lingering spirit, but rather the silent testimony of a crime." The room fell into uneasy silence. Morgan explained his reasoning. Consumption was a common killer, yes, but the doctor's notes suggested irregularities, marks upon the boy's body that did not match the disease. Marks, perhaps, of violence. And the father's insistence on immediate burial hinted at haste, at fear of discovery. What if, Morgan asked, Joseph had not died of illness at all? What if he had been struck down, whether by a too harsh hand or something darker still? The idea shocked his listeners. For decades, the photograph had been treated as a curiosity, a ghost story. Now, Morgan proposed it was a clue evidence preserved by accident, pointing to a hidden act of cruelty. The press seized upon his words. Newspapers printed headlines. Was the Whitcomb ghost child murdered? An haunted photo may reveal 19th century crime. For months, the photograph was thrust into public debate. Television programs featured it, skeptics and believers sparring before cameras. Paranormal investigators flocked to see it. Some swore they felt cold air radiate from the case. Others said they heard faint sobbing when the room was quiet. But more troubling were the historians who began re-examining Ashford's records. They found whispers in old diaries neighbors who described Thomas Whitcomb as cruel, a disciplinarian who left his children bruised. One letter even suggested Margaret had once fled to a neighbor's house with Joseph in her arms, only to return after Thomas demanded her back. The picture grew darker with each discovery. What had once been a tale of sorrow and lingering spirits now carried the stench of possible abuse, perhaps even murder. And suddenly, the faint figure behind Margaret was no longer simply a ghost, it was an accusation. The more people studied the photograph, the more they saw. Some swore Joseph's expression was not blank, but pained his eyes pleading, his mouth half open as if calling for help. Others said his hand on Margaret's shoulder looked not like comfort, but like a grasp, desperate to hold on. The debate raged through the 1980s, dividing believers and skeptics alike. For every historian who called it imagination, another insisted it was evidence. For every skeptic who dismissed it as a flaw, another viewer swore they felt chills when they looked upon it. And through it all, the photograph endured. By the early 2000s, the daguerreotype had passed into the hands of a museum dedicated to New England history. It was displayed in a quiet corner, under dim glass, with a plaque recounting the Whitcomb story. Visitors leaned close, just as Clara had once done, and saw for themselves. Some left shaking their heads, muttering about old wives' tales. Others walked away pale, whispering they would never forget that small, blurred face. The legend did not fade. In fact, it grew, because in the age of the internet, stories travel faster than ever. Soon, images of the daguerreotype spread online, accompanied by the tale of Joseph's death, his ghostly reappearance, and the suspicions of a crime long buried. People across the world leaned toward their screens, studying the grainy scan, asking themselves what they saw. And no matter how many times the photograph was examined by experts, no matter how many articles called it a mere accident of chemistry, the unease remained, because when you looked at it, really looked, you could not deny the sense of presence. You could not shake the feeling that a story too dark for the Whitcombs to admit had been preserved by accident in silver. Perhaps Joseph had been struck, his body failing under the weight of cruelty. Perhaps his mother had known, her grief forever, pressed into her downcast eyes. Perhaps the camera had captured not just light and shadow, but the truth of that household, the sorrow, the violence, the secret. Or perhaps, as some still insist, it was simpler. Perhaps Joseph's spirit had lingered, unwilling to leave, until the moment the camera's eye caught him. Perhaps it was not a clue of crime, but proof of life beyond death. In the end, the Whitcomb photograph remains both a mystery, a mirror, a relic of grief. And still today, when historians lecture on the earliest days of American photography, when collectors pass around daguerreotypes in their velvet cases, someone inevitably brings up the Whitcombs. The room grows quiet, the story is told again, and in that moment, every listener feels the same chill. That history is never just history. That the past does not stay buried, That sometimes, in the most ordinary of places, in a faded photograph from 1847, something waits to be seen, and once seen, it can never be unseen. The Whitcomb family stands forever, frozen in silver. Father stern, mother sorrowful, children solemn. And there, just behind them, a blurred face, a small hand, a boy who should have been alive yet seems already half gone. A normal 1847 photo, until the deadly detail was revealed.